All right, let's get started. Good evening. My name is Barrett Jones, and tonight's webinar is a historical overview of synthesizers in music. It's the first part of a two-part series I'm doing this month, talking about the role of synthesizers in music. And tonight we're going to talk about the beginning of synthesizers, running from actually the late 1800s all the way to 1970. So we're covering a large span of time tonight, and then next week we're going to cover 1970 to the present. So I have to stress that this is overview, and that we probably will have to omit perhaps artists or recordings that you may be familiar with. The intention of this really is to give a student or a music educator a basic overview of the timeline of electronic synthesizers as they developed, really in parallel with the invention of electricity, because even the earliest synthesizer ran off of electricity. So tonight we're going to be taking a look at a number of different devices and some of the artists who played them. Uh, we'll begin with the telharmonium, a instrument developed in 1897. Then we'll go to the theremin, the Odas Martenot, the Hammond organ, the vocoder, the RCA Mark 1 and 2, the Donkamatic from Japan, the Buchla 100, the Moog 1C. A lot of different words right now appearing in probably what looks like just a word salad, but there actually is a narrative arc to all of this. This is basically arranged in chronological order. So as I said, there could be, in this, for the sake of this half-hour webinar, I did have to omit some artists and some devices and inventions from the overview, and you can definitely look in places like Wikipedia or just use Google to find really more detailed timelines in this one. But this is for a start. And another final tip before we get started is that I don't have any audio samples of these different devices, but once again, a quick search of especially YouTube will bring up a lot of these, the sounds actually of these, and some of them are quite interesting. And many of them you're familiar with too, as we shall soon see. So let's get started. Uh, Last month I talked about the basic nuts and bolts of how a synthesizer works. We got into some things about the basic concepts of sound and audio synthesis. And if you haven't, I encourage you to go back and watch that webinar. And I'm sort of drawing off of that when I talk here about additive synthesis, which is one type of audio synthesis. And the earliest synthesizers use the technique of additive synthesis, which creates timbre, which is basically the musical tone, by adding sound waves together. And there are, it's actually no longer, additive synthesis is no longer really used. Now other types of synthesis are used in audio synthesizers, electronic synthesizers, but the very first one used additive synthesis, and that was the telharmonium. Um, the telharmonium was 200 tons and 60 feet long. Whoops, there's a typo there, sorry. Um, it actually took up an entire building in a block in New York City and was run for many years quite successfully. The telharmonium really took the materials that were available at the time and used them to create a synthesizer not only that would synthesize sounds but also would stream them, in this case over telephone lines. So one of the early applications of the telephone exchange in New York City was set up to broadcast from the telharmonium, which was an invention by the American inventor Thaddeus Cahill. Um, and the telharmonium uh, was the first synthesizer to use a tone wheel, and this thing was huge. This is the example of a single tone wheel from the telharmonium. The telharmonium uh, was using a tone wheel, and the tone wheel is essentially a device where the wheel spins and uh, essentially an electromagnetic pickup uh, runs along the ridge of the tone wheel, and that's how the sound is created. And so different tone wheels create different tones. Um, so the telharmonium flourished for several decades, but ultimately was not scalable in any respect. There are actually, I think, three versions of the telharmonium, um, but it really couldn't be replicated for a larger user base. So the next synthesizer that came around that is still known today is the theremin, and that was invented in 1928. The theremin used a different type of synthesis. It was developed by Leon Theremin, pictured here, who actually was doing research on motion sensors for um, during the 1920s. And through his research, he began to study such things as radio signal processing and came upon the invention of the theremin, which bears his name. The theremin uses the heterodyne principle, which involves radio signal processing. Uh, it's a technique of mixing two frequencies to create a new frequency. And it was invented in 1901 by Reginald Fessenden. Um, so once again, this is different from the additive synthesis. Now, theremin is using actually radio. So not a tone wheel, in this case, radio signal processing. Um, the theremin was quite popular in its day. Here's a concert in Paris um, in the 20s. The theremin was used later in the 20th century as a device for special effects in movies. These movies and others all use the theremin to create special effects, and that's what probably it's most well known for today. Um, one person who was responsible for keeping the theremin in popular culture is Bob Moog, and here Bob Moog is pictured with an early theremin of his. He got started in audio electronics and synthesizers with building theremins while he was getting his PhD at Cornell, and Bob Moog became a major name in synthesizers, as we will see later on. The theremin actually did become a respected concert instrument. The woman Clara Rockmore, a female theremin player, was quite renowned and did many soundtracks and performances playing the theremin. Ultimately, the theremin was very difficult to control, so it didn't gain wide use, but composers also such as Edgar Varese and others used the theremin, in this case in his equatorial piece. Um, Around the same time as the theremin, uh, the ondes martenot was developed in 1928. Here's a picture of a ensemble playing the instrument. Um, the inventor of the ondes martenot was Maurice Martenot, and here he is playing his invention with his sister. Um, it's an interesting device. Um, Here's an article that sort of has the nuts and bolts of how it works. You can see the different components that are all hooked together and essentially triggered by um, running the finger with a metal ring around the finger in proximity to a ribbon on the keyboard, and then also using switches that are in this drawer uh, to choose different waveforms, intensity, and different effects. Um, Once again, this is something that bears searching out for audio of. There are performances of it on YouTube, and it's an interesting sounding instrument. It is often uh, sort of lumped together with the theremin because the two do have a similar sound. Here's more, well, a recording probably from the 60s or 70s, celebrating the 50th anniversary um, with performances. And the Ondes Martinet was used a lot also in film scores, including such films as Lawrence of Arabia and The Red Shoes. So then in 1935 came the Hammond organ, and this is really the first synthesizer. Even though it's called an organ, it uses a tone wheel just like the telharmonium did. And the Hammond organ really is the first example here of a synthesizer that still uh, is used today. Um, it's recognized at this point as a really a timeless keyboard, and rock, soul, gospel, jazz, all kinds of different artists have used this over the years. The original one, although there were iterations earlier, but the actual Hammond organ came out in using the tone wheel came out in 1935, invented by Laurens Hammond. Here's the tone wheel for a Hammond B3 organ, which is a little later, but you can see that the bridges on the discs, which run across the amplifier or the pickup rather, and create the different tones. Uh, the Hammond Piers organ is used by thousands and thousands of musicians and composers. Just a handful of early examples here. Um, Jesse Crawford, Jimmy Smith, the jazz organist, and Booker T and the MGs, a 60s instrumental group, used the Hammond organ for some classic keyboard sounds. So as you can tell from the the instruments we've examined so far, many of these instruments were invented in the 1920s or 1930s, yet really were picked up or used later in the century. So, for example, an instrument like the theremin, although it was invented in 28, it was Bob Moog in the 50s and the 60s who kind of brought it back into mass consumption. And a instrument like the Ondes Martenot was brought back into circulation even later by groups such as Radiohead. So all of these different instruments over the course of the years have seen ebbs and flows in terms of how they're used. The vocoder, which was invented in 1935, is probably the most quirky of all the synthesizers we're looking at tonight because it was not invented for music. It was invented by Homer Dudley. Here's a picture of Homer, and Homer worked at Bell telephones, Bell Laboratories. Here's a interesting uh, flyer from old Bell Laboratories. You can tell that they were serious about uh, what they were doing, but actually Bell Labs, as it's referred to, is a famous place that is famous for all kinds of early um, computer innovations. And so the vocoder came out of Bell Labs, who was they were working on a problem of essentially trying to synthesize the voice, but it wasn't for um, musical purposes. It was more for efficiency for telephone communications. In other words, they were trying to figure out a way where they could essentially turn the sound of the voice into an electronic signal that could be processed more efficiently than the method that they were using at the time. And later on, then there were also military applications for disguising the voice, used for example, in secret communications. So here's a sort of a diagram of how the vocoder works. Essentially, on the left is the microphone which the speaker speaks into, and the signal is broken up into different frequencies and passed through different filters. Um, and envelopes then uh, follow the output levels, and then a wave is sent into a corresponding group of filters, a sawtooth wave, a complex wave. We talked about waves in last month's webinar on the basic concepts of sound, so go back to that and take a look if this seems too arcane. And then the output from the the sawtooth is passed through another bandpass filter, and then the output then it consists of something that is essentially the human voice, but then broken up into 8, 10, 12, sometimes 20 different filters, that thereby disguising the voice. And in this instance, the vocoder is using subtractive synthesis. So we talked before about additive synthesis of things like the tone wheel. Now we're looking at the vocoder using subtractive synthesis, which creates timbre by altering sound waves. In this case, the sound wave coming through the microphone is altered and split and directed through a bank of bandpass filters. So it's using subtractive synthesis. Here's a picture of an early vocoder from Bell Labs with some notes scribbled on it. Um, then the vocoder and iterations of the vocoder emerged then throughout the 40s and the 50s and on into the 60s and 70s. The Siemens studio in Germany had a uh, electronic vocoder, and here's some other examples of more modern vocoders, all working in the same way in terms of breaking the vocal input down into separate filters. The what's kind of pretty much acknowledged as the first commercial album using vocoder is an album called The Electric Lucifer by Bruce Hack. I think that came out in maybe it was 69. It's an interesting piece to listen to, and vocoders are heavily used. Um, Next we move on to the RCA Mark 1 and 2 sound synthesizer, another enormous synthesizer. These were basically being made in the mid-50s in a large complex electronic music complex of rooms in New York City and Columbia College. RCA basically built the Mark 1 and 2, and the distinguishing characteristic of this synthesizer is that it was the first programmable synthesizer. Um, Essentially what it did is it ran long scrolls of paper which had different notes punched out on it, much like a old piano scroll in a player piano. So this is something that a technology that had been around for a while, but in this case, the scroll was read and interpreted by the computer, and the the Mark One and the Mark Two also featured a sequencer, the first sequencer found in a synthesizer, and so it was quite popular with modern composers and musicians. And a well-known piece of music is, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Charles Warrenin, Times Encomium was recorded using the Mark II synthesizer, and that came out in the 1969, and as the label says, won the 1970 Pulitzer Prize for Music. It's an interesting piece. It's quirky. Um, so now we move into the early 60s, and we are going to take a look next week in much more detail in this particular genre of synthesizers known as drum machines. But in this in this overview, we'll just acknowledge one of the first drum machines came out in 1963. It was called the Donkamatic, and it was invented by this man, Tsutomu Kato, who eventually became the founder and president of Korg. Um, Here's his very first invention, which you can read. This was the full name of it, on display in the lobby of the Korg headquarters in Tokyo. Um, Here's a later iteration of the Donkamatic. Um, Several different versions came out of a drum machine that became quite popular. And then in '63, over in San Francisco, a composer, or a couple of composers, uh, commissioned a engineer to build a modular synthesizer, and this engineer, Don Buchla, put together the first of a series of synthesizers, which he called the Buchla 100 series modular electronic music system. Here's a picture of Don, and here is the example of the modular synth that he created. It was one of the composers who commissioned him to build the synth was Morton Subotnick, who then used it on the album Silver Apples of the Moon, which is regarded by many as a cornerstone of 60s electronica. That same time period, Bob Moog began moving from theremins into um, modular synthesizers, and really was the first one to develop a commercial modular synthesizer, which was consumer grade and therefore more widely available. Um, Here's a picture of Bob Moog, and here's a picture of the first modular synthesizer that he introduced, the 1C. This synthesizer was used by the musician Wendy Carlos to record an album called Switched on Bach. And this album became tremendously popular in the United States. It sold somewhere north of 500,000 copies. It was a huge hit. And so then it came out with a second one, which was also a hit. And this really propelled the Moog modular synthesizer into the public consciousness, these two albums, which are also considered cornerstones of 60s or electronic music development in general. Also, pop groups then in the late 60s began to use the Moog modular synthesizer. It was used on an album by the Monkees and was used in the movie Performance, which featured Mick Jagger. And it was also, and George Harrison recorded an album using the Moog synthesizer. George Harrison of Beatles fame. So last in our tour here, as we're closing in on the last few minutes of the webinar, is the end of the 60s, the EMS VCS3, which came out in 1969. You can see it here. Um, the VCS standard for Voltage Controlled Studio. And here's an example of uh, the the front panel of the VCS. You can see the choices of inputs on the top, outputs, oscillators, filters, all can be selected on this grid. And the VCS series became heavily used and dearly beloved in the 70s, and we're going to be looking at that next week. But coming in the 60s, in the 69, this album, The Unusual Classical Synthesizer, was released using the VCS3. So that brings us to the last couple minutes here of the webinar. We'll just review the different synthesizers that we looked at over the course of tonight's talk. We looked at the teleharmonium, really acknowledged as the first synthesizer that was invented and built in 1897. There were a couple versions of that. Then we talked about the theremin, which came out, which was first came out in 1928, invented by Leon Theremin, and then was revived later in the 20th century by Bob Moog and others. We also took a look at the Ondes Martenot, also created in 1928, and we talked about the vocoder, created in 1935, the vocoder, the voice synthesizer, using the heterodyne principle. We then moved forward to the 50s, which was the RCA Mark 1 and 2, and that, of course, was the first programmable synthesizer, a major step forward in synthesizer development. And then we talked about the Donkomatic, the first drum machine, which came out in Japan in 1963. And we took a look at the Buchla 100 modular synthesizer and the Moog modular synthesizer, two of the first modular synthesizers to come out in 1967. Modular synthesizer meaning that the different components are essentially separate and different modules are plugged together using patch cords. And then finally we looked at the EMS, the VCS3 in 1969, that came out in 69. So that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening. I'll be talking next week about synthesizers in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the aughts. And so until then, if you have any questions, you can reach me, Barrett, at dcbclub.com.